I'm talking this afternoon about a feasibility study that we conducted in our department in collaboration with Amy Weatherby at Florida State University. And by way of a very short introduction, we know based on school records and clinical records that ASD is significantly under-identified and under-treated in South Africa. And there's really a great need to focus on early detection and early intervention under 3, particularly as we know that the red flags, as we've heard this morning from Dr. Dawson, that the red flags for ASD really are evident by 18 to 24 months, and that early intervention can make a significant difference to the trajectory of these children. But there's a significant research to practice gap in South Africa in this area of early detection and early intervention, and what it really points to is a need for training, training professionals that is innovative, scalable, and evidence-based. And it's precisely this research to practice gap that prompted researchers at Florida State University to develop Autism Navigator. And Autism Navigator is a unique collection of web-based tools and courses, and one of the unique features of it is that it uses extensive video footage to illustrate red flags of ASD and also early intervention practices to try and bridge this gap. And the professional development course that we focused on in this study was the Autism Navigator for primary care. And this was designed for first port of call professionals, so including general practitioners, special educators, more specialist medical personnel, paramedical personnel like therapists, anyone who might be approached by a family saying, I'm concerned about my child's development. And as you can see there are 6 units in the course, and the focus is to try and raise awareness and expertise in identifying red flags between 18 and 24 months of age to facilitate earlier referral and earlier access to intervention. So we were interested to see what did the South African providers think of this particular course, and did it have any effect on their knowledge. I asked a broad array of service providers if they would. I invited them to do this course, and I only asked them to do units 1 to 3. You can see the topics there, because this was really the meat of early detection. Units 4, 5, and 6 also contain a lot of reference to legislation in the States, Part C and that kind of thing, so I felt that units 1 to 3 were the most universally applicable. So we had 80 participants who signed consent for the study, and you can see at each stage, this was across a wide array of vocational domains. There were folks from public health, in the private health setting, in special education, in autism-specific non-profits, and students. And we had postgraduate students or psychiatry registrars, so mature, skilled students, and we also had undergraduate medical students who knew more or less nothing about autism. Of those 80, 76 filled in the pre-training forms, so a little bit of attrition at the beginning. And those 76 were all sent an enrollment code. So they get to enroll on the training site independently and complete the training on their own, at their own pace. And you can see that 66 of those 76 actually took the code and enrolled on the training site. And of those 66, 62 actually completed the course. So quite a high percentage of course completion of those who started the course, but we had already lost a few before we got to that point. And then 51 completed the post-training forms, which I used to analyze various parameters in the study. So that was our overall research completion rate. Those 62 participants who completed the course were mostly second language speakers, mostly Afrikaans. Most had access to a computer and internet, but there was a small subgroup that clearly did not own their own computer, so they only had access at work. And about half of the participants reported that they worked frequently with children with ASD or had previously identified ASD, but only 11 felt confident doing so. There was a range of professional categories. You can see there were 6 nurses, 5 were in the public sector, included clinic nurses from surveillance clinics, as well as mental health nurses and 1 private nurse practitioner, only 2 GPs, which is interesting, and we'll come back to this point later. And then nearly half the sample consists of therapists, speech language, OT, physical therapists, or psychologists, or special needs teachers. There you can see the 5 registrars, psychiatry registrars, and the 5 undergrad medical students. We had 2 pediatric specialists, and then a group of other, and most of the folks from the non-profits fitted into that category. Some were business managers, some had other types of degrees. So the first result that we had a look at was their utilization of the training site. So basically, because it's a web-based training, we can harvest information about how the users engaged with the site, how long they were on the site, etc. So you can see the time spent in each unit. Now in the top there you can see unit 1 should take about 25 minutes if you scroll through each slide once and watch each video once. And you can see that the group on average spent quite a bit longer than 25 minutes in unit 1, but you can also see from that standard deviation that there was a huge amount of variability, and in fact lots of outliers in a positive direction. So there were folks who just spent an inordinately longer amount of time in the unit. Similar for unit 2 and for unit 3. You can see in the second row the time that they spent in the learner assessments, also a large amount of variability. Most of the participants could pass the learner assessments. There's learner assessments at the end of each unit. But you can see in the last row that at least about a quarter had to do the assessment more than once to get a pass, which was 80%. We found that education did not, there were no relationships between education and these utilization statistics. But we did notice that the second language speakers tended to spend longer in the learner assessments than the first language speakers for all the units. So there really seemed to be possibly a language implication there. We also noticed in terms of the time spent in unit 3, that's the longest unit and the real meat of the early detection information. And we found that those who had lower computer access, so probably that group that didn't have their own computer, tended to spend less time in unit 3, and they also rated their computer skills as lower than the rest. And so I think that's really a question of computer access. If you don't have access to a computer, you tend to spend less time in the actual training, and your computer skills you don't feel as confident. We found that those who had more experience with ASD tended to spend longer in the units, so they really felt like they were people who were very interested in this information and really plumbed the depths of everything they could get out of the training. And then there was another group who tended to spend very little time in Unit 3, and they had to spend more time doing the learner assessments and do more attempts to pass the learner assessments. So there were some people who really spent less time than it would take to scroll through every slide. And I think there's a real question of motivation there, and this was a voluntary study, so I'm not sure what the issues were going on there, but it's an important aspect to consider in these kinds of self-study trainings. We also did looked at some changes in knowledge from before to after the training. We found that participants were able to free recall or generate more red flags of ASD that could be present in children 12 to 24 months of age. Significantly more felt that we could actually detect ASD 24 months or younger. And they felt, there was a reduction in the number of topics they felt they needed more training in, and they also felt more confident in applying many of the topics. We also had an 18-item knowledge scale, and there was a statistically significant improvement in this. But if you look at the mean score changes, it's not great. It's not a very big difference. And we also found that not only previous experience with ASD, but also first language and education were associated with the pre-training knowledge score. So we're not really sure what we're measuring there with our knowledge scale. Measuring knowledge seems to be very tricky. And that's all I want to say about that. We followed up the training with some in-depth individual interviews and focus groups with a subset of the participants. In line with feasibility study design and so forth, to really get an idea of what people felt about the training and whether it was needed and whether it would be feasible in South Africa with this group who had just completed the training. And so the first theme that emerged from this data really related to the relevance of the content in the training course and the tools. And the first thing we noticed is that there were quite a few aha moments. So this participant said, the concept of how early intervention can change the trajectory. That's not something I knew before. They showed the secondary effects on learning, and I thought, wow, that's really profound. And I mean, if you think of that in line with Dr. Dawson's talk this morning, it's not something that people can think about, that can we actually change the child's, neural plasticity as a result of intervention? And this is a message that's put across strongly in the training. I really enjoyed the difference between normal and autism features developing over time, comparing as they grew older, which was really clever, and it brings it alive. So this was somebody commenting on the longitudinal comparisons of children with and without ASD as they get older, which was very, very helpful in their understanding. The video concept is brilliant because you can talk and talk, but until you actually see it with your eyes, it means nothing because it's so subtle. So I think throughout all the interviews and the focus groups, the value of the video illustrations was really highlighted. And seems to be a very unique and strength of the training program. I love doing the assessments at the end. I liked seeing if I could get it right. This was not a universal feeling, as you'll see in the next slide. I found the scripts being available very useful. You can highlight things on there. So basically the narration of all of the slides is available as a PDF. You can download that and keep that in as a resource. And there are various other tools for families and for professionals that can be downloaded and used again and again. So overall, with respect to the relevance of the content, it was very, very positive. People felt that the content was relevant to South Africa as much as it is in the United States. And it really came across as needed because there were gaps in knowledge that were very much identified by the participants themselves. The second major sort of theme that we were looking at in the qualitative data was related to feasibility, though, and this came down to questions of access and service delivery. Not very surprisingly, one of the main barriers was actually related to the internet access. So it's a web-based course, and you do need high-speed internet to run the videos. You don't download the videos, that you just watch them as you would a YouTube video. Bearing in mind that everybody who participated in the focus group was able to complete it. But in the middle of this, I wondered how much of my bandwidth or my data have I used? People were a bit concerned about the costs of doing the course, and how much data it uses. It's on average about 1 gigabyte, I hope I'm saying that right, an hour, similar to watching Netflix, something like that, okay? The worst part for us, being Afrikaans, was we didn't always understand the question. So this relates back to that it really confirms that quantitative finding, where the second language speakers generally spent longer in the learner assessment. They found the language very tricky, and it's all multiple choice, and you know how those multiple choice questions seem to be out to get you half the time. Unit 3 took too long. I didn't have the capacity to take it all in. There were lots of complaints about the length of Unit 3 and the course overall, and remember, I only asked the participants to do the first half of the training course. So length does seem to be an issue related to feasibility. It's unlikely that folks are going to finish the whole thing if it's going to be that long. And then lastly, an ethical dilemma, I guess, because if you do identify, you should be able to provide intervention. I mean, you do what you can. It's like that with every diagnosis. It's just the South African context, which is quite sad. This really came through very, very loudly in the groups. Well, that's all very well. Even if we do detect who we're going to refer them to, the service can't handle them. We don't know what to do in that respect. So that is definitely an aspect of feasibility that we need to consider. A final question I asked participants was, well, who do you think would benefit from this course? Who do you think in our South African service provision context should have this course? And if you're familiar with a word cloud, the size of the font indicates the number of times people mention that particular group or category. And you can see GPs is the biggest. And they were one of the smallest groups of people who completed the training. So people really felt, you know, if GPs could get this kind of training, then it wouldn't be that case of, doctor, my child's not talking, oh, well, he's a boy, let's bring him back in a year. That we would really be able to prevent that sort of thing happening. And also clinic sisters. So folks really felt like clinic sisters, if they could do some sort of training like this, that their threshold of awareness would just help them steer the families much more early on to an appropriate path. So we have some future steps. We would, I think, I do believe that the course contains extremely relevant and helpful information. There are some aspects of feasibility that we will need to think about, and it's really about access and motivation. I think that those two factors really came through in this study. In terms of the length, there are now shorter versions of this particular course. The developers have come out with a jumpstart unit, which is only 90 minutes, kind of gives us the highlights of the whole program, which we could pilot with a group of service providers. There's also a course about autism in toddlers, which is about 2 to 3 hours, and it's a free course available on the internet that we could potentially investigate with a sample. And I think it would be particularly valuable to grow the sample with the recommended target audience and implement supports and adaptations as needed for those population groups. And the last point that I would make is that we can't continue this work on early detection if we don't address that aspect that was raised of great concern, which is the service delivery pathway. Who do we refer to? And so we are starting to, and as you've heard from a number, and you'll hear even more tomorrow about expanding capacity for evidence-based early intervention for children under 3. There's a companion professional development course for the Autism Navigator for early intervention providers, and we're looking at ways that we can adapt and use that particular course in the South African context. Thanks very much.